Welcome everyone who's listening or watching today. We do because we care. My name is Marek Kucharski and I work at Evangelical School of Theology in Wrocław, Poland. In light of so many recent challenges, we continue interviews titled Church, New Challenges. Today I invited Pastor John Bryson and his African-American partner in ministry from Memphis, Tennessee. Welcome, John and Jason.
Thank you for having us.
Hey, we're glad to be here.
Hey, John. Let me introduce John first, called JB quite often. John is married to Beth, and he has been married for 26 years. They are the proud parents of 6 children, and all names start with B. Brooke, Beck, Bo, Boss, Blair, and Payne. I guess that's the right pronunciation. John is well educated, has a doctorate in leadership from Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary, the MBA and master from Dallas Seminary. Did some writings. He does consulting, investing in churches, leaders, and great ideas. Very great practitioner. However, in 2003, John moved to Memphis to co-found Fellowship Memphis, a multicultural church. Okay, John, how about you introduce your partner, Jason Cook?
Yeah, I'd love to do that. Jason's a good friend as well as a fellow pastor with me at Fellowship Memphis. He grew up in the American South as an African-American and has a unique perspective on our topic today, race in America. And then played ball at the University of Mississippi, which has its own unique race and is from Bryson, super smart guy, is one of our primary leaders and teachers and pastors here at Fellowship Memphis, has been here 4 or 5 years, married to Courtney, great husband, got 3 young kids himself. And this is an area of passion. He has constructed multiple hour courses and really helped lead our body on how to think about the gospel and race, the church and race, and specifically race in America. We know race isn't a unique problem to America, but it has its own unique story because of the American story. So I'm glad Jason can join us on this.
Okay. Welcome both of you again. Let's start with helping us to understand the meaning of multicultural church. What does that mean? Maybe Jason will start.
Yeah, I think on its face, multicultural church implies that there are multiple cultures that are present within a church. And those multiple cultures include racial cultures, they include ethnic cultures, they include socioeconomic stratification and different cultures in there. We tend to refer to multicultural church here in Memphis as multi-ethnic, and having those different ethnic groups present that really bring to full and to light this Ephesians 2, this Revelation 5 and 7 picture of this heavenly reality. There is an ontological reality of a multi-ethnic, cross-cultural, transracial church in heaven. And so one of the reasons why JB founded Fellowship Memphis, and one of the things that we march toward to try to achieve, is that reality here in our city now.
Okay, so John, tell me, what ethnics are present in your church, actually? I mean,
yeah, so
where are they from?
I'm not all over. We're kind of a global city, operations like FedEx. We've got Indians and African Americans. We've got Africans. We're home to the University of Tennessee's medical school. We've got the University of Memphis. And so there are all kinds of different ethnicities that are in and around our church. And it's a beautiful thing to see and to learn from.
Okay. Let me share one picture of your family. And I was surprised. Can you see it?
Oh, yeah, there they are.
Okay.
Years ago.
A nominal Polish person would be surprised because there are, 2 ethnic boys there, So my question is, how is it to be a daddy of adopted 2 boys with African-American background? Have you experienced any challenges in that area, or Memphis just became friendly place accepting such decisions?
Yeah, that's a complex answer to that question. But in some ways, yes, because Memphis is a majority minority city. So almost everywhere we go in our city, my two African-American boys, majority culture. And so that's a blessing. But man, to raise two African-American boys in America with our racial history and with our current racial situation is also heart-wrenching. And I shared this story with our church a couple of weeks ago, but during this COVID pandemic, all of my kids have gotten into bike riding. And there was a certain evening, I think it was right after the George Floyd situation and murder, where two of my boys took off down the street one way on their bikes, and my two African-American boys went up my cove and then turned out of my sight. And the emotion inside of me of fear, of wanting to run in front of them and like run to every one of my neighbors' houses and say, hey, these are my boys. Like the fear that they would cut through somebody's backyard. Like that is a real thing. That is a extra weight. I read a book a few years ago, The Soul of Black Folk, written around 1905 by W.E.B. Du Bois, brilliant intellectual. Read everything you can from him. He describes that as a double consciousness, that African Americans have to live in America with a double consciousness and the weight of that. That if Jason and I go to lunch today and we sit down and the server is rude to us, all I think initially is, I wonder if they're having a bad day or if they're a jerk. Jason has to think about, I wonder if they're having a bad day or they're a jerk or they're a racist and don't like the fact that a black man's sitting at their table. Like that is just this extra weight that my African-American brothers and sisters have to carry that is, I am sure, exhausting. I've heard them express that as just exhaustive. And so bring this full circle, I've got to help those two boys, help my whole family navigate the fact we live in a racialized society. And then I have to help my two African-American boys prepare them for that. That's a weight they're going to have to carry in our country.
Well, okay. Thank you. Well, that's a great insight. Okay. Jason, how is it for you, African-American, and your family to live in such a free country as USA? And then please understand, for us, for Poles, America has always been Neverland because, after Second War, 1945, we became a communist country, by force. 40 years, under dictators, and getting a ticket to USA, that would be a dream of any family because that means wealth, freedom, free speech, and everything. Well, there you go. You have African-American. How do you feel about your country?
Yeah, well, let me first say I love my country. There's a lot of what you just described that's true. The freedom here, the freedom to speak, the freedom to be, democracy here in the West, particularly in America, has proven itself to be a world structure that has worked and has been really prosperous for us. I think all those things you mentioned, safety, wealth, prosperity, those things can be found here. There is, though, a dichotomy. There are two different Americas in some respects. There's an America for fair-skinned people, and there's an America for brown and black-skinned people. Now, those opportunities in some ways are still present for both of those groups, but for those with darker skin, those opportunities tend to be less, further apart from one another and seen in a different light. And so, as an African-American growing up here in America, all those opportunities were there, but I was taught by my parents that with the skin color that I have, I'm going to have to work twice as hard as my white counterparts for half of the success. Go ahead.
Would you say that me being white, it would be easier to get a job in USA?
I would say that if based on your skin color, yes. But given your name on a resume, that could be a different story, right? your name on a resume may betray your ethnic heritage. And a lot of places you go in the United States, that wouldn't matter. And in some places, it would actually count in your favor. There are a lot of African Americans whose names on a resume prevent them from even getting in the door. And that's because of centuries long hatred and animosity, in large part due to America's first inherent sin, which was slavery, and the effects of slavery that still persist even here into 2020.
Yeah, let me make a remark here. 65 years ago, part of your everyday life in USA, part of your culture, there was a sign. There was just a present sign everywhere. And let me put this here. Colored only, no whites allowed. You know, there were places where white people and black people could not sit together or use the same place. However, because of changes and segregation sounds like it's gone in USA, and today it's not a problem. And then we actually can freely get together today and talk about the issues 65 years ago, not possible, I think, you know. My question is, are there any remarks or behaviors from those times still present in your everyday culture? Maybe Jason first and then John.
Yeah, that's a good question. You know, I think those signs kind of represent what we would refer to as overt racism, which is really just out front in the open for everybody to see. That overt racism would segregate those places, restaurants, lunch counters, clubs, bars, quite literally every facet of society. I think what we find today in an age of integration is more subversive racism, which is all places are integrated, but not all places may be welcoming to those who don't share the skin color of the dominant people. Now, in a city like Memphis has a history of having sort of cross-cultural, multi-ethnic spaces because of blues music, which is a type of American invention, because of barbecue, which is an American cuisine. Historically, people in Memphis have seen and have hung out and have eaten and sang across those lines. But there are still places, there's still white space and black space that can be hostile to people who don't share the skin color of that dominant culture that kind of runs that space.
So, John, this is not formally regulated anymore, the segregation. So children go to school today, but socially, psychologically, would you say still there are spaces like that?
Yes, and I think it's important. You mentioned 60 years ago, and you know, you got a country that's 250 or so years old. I mean, we're only, you know, for 80+% of the history of our country, there was overt racism and overt practices to make sure white folks held on to wealth and power. And so to just be a few decades removed from that, of course, we're still dealing with the lingering causes of that effect. And so like although there is a growing equality in like salary in corporate America, that's an advancement. But there's also white America had a 200-year head start on wealth. And so that creates its own issues. And because neighborhoods were segregated for decades and centuries in cities like ours, you just don't undo that in 20 or 30 years. And so particularly in cities where the suburban movement moved through the 70s and 80s, and a lot of the phrase white flight, and a lot of white upward mobile families moved out of the city, and it created a suburbs, and a city almost meant black-white, almost meant that. And then that created this housing. You know, most people in America grew up in a neighborhood with people who looked exactly like them.
Well, let me tweak that a little bit, because Tennessee is home for the largest African-American population. Memphis played a prominent role in American civil rights movement historically. So can this be overwhelming for white people? Can it be racist toward white people too? Because I don't know, is it like 60, 70% population in Memphis Black, or I'm wrong, or 50?
Yeah, the
50s,
city
low 60s. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, when I was in Africa once, I was shocked, the feeling I was only one white. I understood what people in different color skin can feel when we are in Europe, you know. So, John, do you sense anything like that? Because it seems like only white people are racist, but would you say, is this the same on the other side, or you don't see that at all?
Yeah, we normally have to nuance that some, and some would argue that you can't be racist because of the power dynamics into that. I would use the word prejudice. I think absolutely all races can have stereotypes and prejudice and makes assumptions about people based on their skin color. Have I personally felt that I'll just tell a more redemptive story. I love going into portions of Memphis that are almost 100% African-American with my two African-American sons and receiving the love I receive. Or if I'm in line at Kroger and it's an African-American young lady checking me out, I know a lot of times she's a little nicer to me than the next older white person behind me who doesn't have two African-American sons with him. So I've definitely felt that as I've navigated this city. But you're going to find that's just complex. There's a whole lot of stuff in a city like ours.
Yeah, Merrick, what I would say, I can't speak to the experience of being white in America, but I do think what JB's kind of referring to is there's a couple of different ways that you can define racism. One is sort of a sociological definition, which is kind of what JB alludes to, which is essentially power dynamics kind of play into racism. And sociologically, if you have power, you can be racist. If you don't have power, then you can't be racist. I think as Christians, what the Bible calls partiality is akin to what racism would be. And so when it comes to showing favoritism or showing partiality, I think every last one of us is capable of showing partiality. I think every last one of us is capable of showing that. And every single person walking the face of the earth right now has prejudice. That's a fact. There's no one who is free of that. So I do think if we're using a sociological definition, then the answer to your question is no. I think if we're using a biblical definition, then the answer to your question is yes. And certainly in terms of prejudice, as JB alluded to, we are all prejudiced and we're all guilty of that, myself included.
And okay. Mark, I would add what you described as, being in Africa and recognizing you were the only white guy around is actually a helpful tool that we use. We call that displacement. And part of, I think, a journey to racial reconciliation or to becoming an anti-racist is to actually intentionally displace yourself continually. I think that helps you build empathy toward what it feels like for any minority group to be in a majority culture. Okay,
cool. I love it. Memphis is also known for National Museum of Civil Rights. Actually, this is a motel where Martin Luther King was shot and turned into a place where you can learn history of slavery, Civil War, peaceful protests, and mistreatment of colored people. I was actually had a chance to visit that place, and a year ago, I was amazed and overwhelmed. It helped me to understand colored people fight over the years just to get the same rights as white have. And now we have this George Floyd situation. Can you give us some examples of racism in present times?
Yeah, well, when the foundation of your country is built on one group of people is better than another group, to put another way, one group of people is superior to another group, you're going to find those disparities just about everywhere. Mm-hmm. And you've got everything from macro levels of racism. Just a couple of years ago, a couple of prominent banks were found to be restrictive in their lending toward African Americans. More immediately here in our city, there's a prominent restaurant here in our city that basically sat African Americans in a different part of the restaurant so as to be less visible to clientele who might come in. You've got active racism in, just about every strata of our fabric in our society. I think what's most damaging is those subtle, and really not even subtle, those acts that are hidden from larger private public spaces, particularly in homes, around dinner tables, in friend groups, and in schools, where narratives and histories that are incomplete and other anecdotal references to those who are not in power, those not in the majority, those not with white skin, are now seen as inferior or less than. So that's a really, really complex question, and it's a huge question. There's examples all over the place, but those are just a couple of examples.
Okay. John?
Yeah, I would just say thank God for iPhones that have video recorders, or who knows how long that small percentage of racist bad cops would continue. I mean, would we even know the George Floyd story if somebody hadn't been able to record that? And so that's been a common grace of the Lord to really expose the killing of unarmed Black people.
Okay, let's talk about church. What is the church role in facing such a social injustice?
We are humbly learning how to stay in that battle 16 years later. We don't posture ourselves as experts or professionals, but I do think we have made that a priority for the life of our church. Our church was built on trying to help, by God's grace, over the next few decades, be a solution, be a place where we can create anti-racist and talk with a higher IQ than the norm about issues of race and the gospel. I'm super encouraged at the trajectory at which the church is having to wrestle with race, but also get really discouraged. I'll just speak for my white brothers and sisters. I call it racial IQ. How often just a super low racial IQ gets exposed where there hasn't been much thought, discipleship toward church movement, toward a higher understanding of what the Bible has to say about race and how we can work that into our spiritual formation.
Mm. Yeah. I heard from one pastor, 70 of them from evangelical churches, they met, and then white pastors apologized, African-American pastors for racism. I mean, that was one of the acts which happened. Hopefully it's meaningful and all that stuff. But Jason, as African-American, what would you expect from church leaders of church to happen?
Yeah, I think the first thing that I expect is any fight for social justice needs to be couched in God's word through the lens of the Great Commandment and for the sake of Christ Jesus. And I say that because of the waters can get muddied if we're talking about social justice for social justice's sake, or if we're pressing and fighting for social justice for the sake of Christ, the kingdom of God, and for his church. And so I think a pastor's role is to fall in line with the apostolic role, both in Acts and all throughout the Pauline epistles. And even the Petron epistles, where Peter and Paul and others are arguing for Christians should care about the least of these, those who are most vulnerable. Jesus takes women and children, poor people, sick, lame, and he gives them dignity and worth. He fights actively for them. So I think the church's role is to bear witness to what's true in light of the ways in which living in a fallen world among fallen men distorts or tries to deny that truth. And that means publicly bearing witness to what's true. That means public discipleship, like teaching people what that looks like to follow Jesus in these ways, teaching and training and equipping families in our church to fight at every level of their life for the dignity and humanity of their neighbor, and ultimately to exalt the name of Jesus over and against all principalities, authorities, and rulers in spiritual realms. Because as much as people want to make our fight against Black people or against white people or against those who are from different parts of the world, we know Paul tells us that our battle and our wrestle is not against flesh and blood. So how do we take the very spiritual realities of this fight and marry them with an ancient, historic, apostolic lineage to bear witness to the truth today? I think that's in part what the role of the pastor and the role of the church should be. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I just reading about racism. I learned one thing, that in 1985, Southern Baptist Convention, which came into being during a North-South split over slavery, they acknowledge and apologize to all African Americans for perpetuating individual and systematic racism in our life. In your opinion, has the church been contributing to racism over years? If yes, in what way? I mean, we know the gospel, we know biblical truths. Like here in Europe, when fascism came, church supported, and then Lutheran Church apologized after Second War. They contributed in this movement. Do you sense any such thing in last, I would say, 60 years, that the church also contributed in that? I've heard a saying like being just silent, for instance.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yes. The answer to your question is yes. I think in varying degrees, depending on which church, and some of those ways are glaringly obvious by the omission of African Americans or people of color in their assembly, on their staffs, in their leadership. I think by publicly, churches during integration, during the civil rights movement, being opposed to people of color being a part of their church or even stepping foot in their church. Even now, there are still churches that don't want people of color on their property, don't want them getting baptized, don't want them being a member of the church because of some irrational fear that they attach to the presence of those people. I think in America right now, what we're seeing is that the American church in a lot of ways is shifting and changing to kind of bring out that historical, apostolic, Christocentric voice, while there's a large portion of the church that continues to be complicit with a lot of racialized practices. And so I can only speak generally. Generally, the answer to your question is yes. And yet there's a ton of movement by churches here in the West that are actively resisting those forms of racism, those overt, big, systemic parts, expressions of racism here in America.
Okay, John, racism has been going over, through, years. Is there hope today to make a change, make a difference?
Yes, there's always hope when it involves the gospel and Jesus and his redemptive work on this place. I want to be clear that America didn't invent racism. Racism has been around since the biblical times. It's an idol of our heart. You look underneath racism, and you're going to find self-righteousness. You're going to find pride, and so it's one of the ways that self-righteousness and pride manifest. One of the ways it can show itself is that I'm better than you, and so. In that sense, until Jesus comes back and makes all things new, I don't think racism is going away. I do think a group of Christ followers who truly live out the gospel, as Jason mentioned, have their convictions rooted in Scripture, can see a lot of healing and a lot of both systemically and individually, see progress. The more there's repentance and humility and multi-decade work in all pulling in the same direction. So I do have hope in that.
Okay. One of the things which is happening, I mean, the movement which started after this death, unfortunate death, is that, a lot of protest is going on in USA, but also around the Europe. I'll show you a few pictures. This is Frankfurt, Germany, for instance. Here you go. Here's Poland, Warsaw, Black Lives Matter. Can you give me also some update on today? How are the things going on? I mean, are the protests getting smaller or there's more? How about the violence? How's life in Memphis now? This is Great Britain, by the way.
Yeah, what's been really encouraging, Mark, is protests are still going on. They're still happening. What's been encouraging is there's been a lot of movement from local and state officials to press into some areas of police reform, and not only police reform, but there have been national brands and organizations and companies who are coming to grips with and dealing with the racialized aspects of their brands and businesses that have been built on the sort of inequities between these large ethnic groups. And so protests are still happening. People are still marching. There's still activism happening on Twitter and a lot of other places. There's still active resistance to those things. And there's still so many folks here in the States who just reject any idea of racism, of systemic racism, of individualized racism. Christians especially are prone to individualize and particularize racism as an individual sin problem, as opposed to understanding the history and the sociological scope of it. So there has been a lot of really encouraging movement in ways that we did not see in 2014 when a similar police shooting happened in a city called St. Louis here. This has been really unique, and it's been really, really special.
What was that? What happened in St. Louis?
So 2014, a young African-American man named Mike Brown was killed by a police officer in the middle of the street. The details surrounding the case, differ based on whose autopsy you read and who you're talking to. But essentially, Mike Brown was shot multiple times. Some say while he was running away from a white police officer in St. Louis, and that sparked, that was really the genesis of the Black Lives Matter movement that actually started on Twitter but that happened in the summer of 2014.
So would you encourage Christians to take and be part of those protests?
Absolutely, yeah, and it's been encouraging seeing our church get involved. One night I wasn't downtown.
Okay. You said church get involved. Give me an example.
I'm just talking about individuals in our church that have taken part in those marches. Even over the years have built relationships. I'm thinking of one guy in our church who's very active in our city, who's built a relationship with one of the primary march organizers in our city over the last 7 years. And it's been encouraging to see that happen.
What advice would you give to a younger generation? What do they need to carry in their hearts for the next 60 years?
Yeah, I'd say a couple of things. I think one on a spiritual side and one on a more integrated spiritual practical side. One is, man, do not give up or deny the power of prayer in the movement. That is so incredibly important. And really that's going to drive so much of and keep us anchored as those who are fighting for this change, keep us anchored in hope. Because the social justice movement has no hope. Ontologically, there is no hope there. The end of it is, hey, we can all sit at a table and make some decisions, but you're ultimately going to keep fighting a fight. prayer keeps you anchored and rooted in this eschatological reality that Christ will rise victorious. He will inherit a bride, not a harem. That prayer is the thing that not only tempers our zeal, but even sometimes makes us more zealous. On the other side, I would say, do not be lulled into sleep thinking that liberal or leftist policies will replace the opposite end of more conservative white supremacist policies. And I'm talking mostly here in America. I don't know the geopolitical situation in Poland, but I'm watching a lot of young people leave the sort of conservative centers for a political left, seeing their causes line up. But that can be dangerous if you walk that line too far, because then you abandon the good biblical principles. And so we've got to live in the tension of the worlds that we live in, the ideologies that we believe in, and make sure that we have the Bible on one hand, that we got Twitter and Facebook in the other hand, and we're living in tension between those two, but always keeping careful to keep the Bible above all of these social issues. Those would be two pieces of advice that I give young people.
Thank you. Mr. John, the educated one.
No, I don't know about that. Well, obviously, all racism is taught. So, I mean, just as parents, you have the ability to raise an anti-racist. You have the ability to educate your kids about issues of race and the gospel. I would echo my friend Jason's call to just prayer and the call to not put our ultimate hope in a single policy or a political party or some kind of platform, but to go deeper than that, that we want to see hearts transformed. That's what we're shooting for.
Mm. Well, I'm sure that behind your efforts, and I can see you're great fighters, behind your success are your spouses. So I'm glad they allowed you to have that interview, that you can peacefully, they taking care of children, you can peacefully sit with me. One of the things I appreciate highly that three of us can talk freely. I think we've made some progress, and your country made some progress, since Martin Luther King death. And again, as you mentioned, Jesus is only hope, the biblical principles. Thank you for your time, and may God bless you in your ministry. We highly appreciate what you are doing, and then that you're an example. So thank you so much for sharing your thoughts and insights. God bless you guys.
Thanks for having us.
Yep. Thanks, Mark.
Bye-bye.